Women and the working classes found their voices after the war through socialism and some through communism. In 1928, the right to vote was extended to all adults without distinction as to race, sex, belief, intelligence or status. Marian Phillips was the first female Jewish MP, a feminist pioneer. She motivated the first women's movements in the Labour Party and got hundreds of thousands of women involved in issues that we now take for granted, including equality for women in the workplace, and a more safety-conscious approach to designing homes, which could now include an indoor bath and a toilet, no longer just a convenience. The Jewish vote was still insignificant, except in one or two seats, such as the Jewish immigrant district of Whitechapel, which had an excellent Jewish Liberal candidate in Barnett Janner, who won. He was an indefatigable defender of the rights of all ordinary citizens, opposed Mosley and his British Nazis, and battled hard to get Britain to ratify the Genocide Convention. But the Liberal Party was no longer the only natural home of Jewish candidates. The Labour Party now attracted Jewish MPs who wanted to alleviate desperate poverty across Britain. Manny Xinhua from Linlithgow, Scotland, was not a miner. He was a tailor. He hadn't gone to university. He'd educated himself at the local library. Often attacked for his religion, he became an activist for the Glasgow Trades Union Council. In 1919, he led a strike and an 80,000-strong demonstration in favour of a 40-hour week. Events became violent.
And we had 80,000 men in George Square and the environs of the square in the morning. And we thought it was all right. But meanwhile, the tanks were in the cattle market and the Gallowgate, and the soldiers were on the roof. Lloyd George arranged it all because they thought we were going to have a revolution.
For this, they became known as the Red Clydesiders, and Manny Xinhua spent 5 months in jail. A while later, having beaten Ramsay MacDonald, Xinhua was to become a colossus in the Commons. He wrote the Labour Party manifesto, which brought Clement Attlee into power, beating Churchill in 1945. And he nationalised the mines and other key industries. Nevertheless, Churchill remarked upon what he termed his sterling patriotism. An MP from 1922 until he was made a peer in 1970, Xinhua became the first member of the House of Lords to reach 100 years.
To Manny, on your 100th birthday, to Manny.
In the 1920s and 30s, there was a worldwide economic slump, the Great Depression. King George V accepted Liberal leader Herbert Samuel's recommendation to form a national government of political parties. This became even more vital as the threat of World War II approached. Parliamentarians appreciated what British Jews had contributed to the nation.
Jews are just like you and me, ordinary common-sense people. No one here, I hope, believes that because you happen to be born in a particular place or of particular parents, you're better or worse than other people.
Jewish MPs continued to vote along party lines, including agreeing to placate the Arab world again because of the need for oil. And MPs effectively stopped Jews escaping Europe to seek asylum in British Palestine. That said, between 1933 and 1939, the British did better than most by making 80,000 visas available to European Jews. Unfortunately, 20 to 30,000 were not used.
When Earl Baldwin broadcast his appeal for Jewish refugees from Germany, he spoke as an ordinary Englishman, shocked and distressed by the plight of a despised and rejected people and their innocent children. He pleaded for help for the victims of the Nazi regime who turned to England for succor. He spoke of thousands of men and women despoiled of their goods, driven from their homes, seeking a hiding place from the wind, seeking sanctuary on our doorstep. He called it a world's good cause, for these were victims not of any catastrophe of the natural world, not of earthquake, nor flood, nor famine, but of man's inhumanity to man. Meanwhile, these child refugees from Germany, who have found shelter in Britain, are being cared for and are learning to play a useful part in the nation's work.
During the Second World War, Jews fought disproportionately for Britain, even if that meant hardship for Jews in other countries. With many Jewish MPs on the front line, there were less in Parliament. But Leopold Amery led the notorious Norway debate in 1940. After a string of military and naval disasters were announced, Amery famously attacked Chamberlain's government, quoting Oliver Cromwell.
"Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go."
The debate led to the resignation of Chamberlain and the appointment of Churchill as Prime Minister. The post-war period again saw British parliamentarians, like any other British citizens, taking on the responsibilities of representation, fighting against poverty and injustice on behalf of their constituents, committed to the common good. Between 1945 and 1950, the Minister of Town and Country Planning was Louis Silkin. Much of the country had been heavily bombed, and he helped create new towns like Huntingdon and Milton Keynes. Many Jews supported nationalization, and many others supported privatization. Some were for Europe and others against.
I have no quarrel with the European Economic Community, otherwise known as the Common Market. None at all. I just want to have nothing to do with it.
Many formed and supported the Council for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. Many others were opposed. Frank Alorn organized the CND march to Aldermaston nuclear plant. Reg Friesen joined in. They also both made their mark protesting against terrible housing conditions.
Slums, the relics of a long-forgotten industrial revolution, but still hanging on like a bad taste left in the mouth. In the last 20 years, we've seen massive redevelopment programs, but the problem is still far from over. Today, even a really basic, cheap house will still cost you £5,000. What's more, building societies often don't lend on that sort of property.
The equation was easy, as Alorn said.
The choice is between bathrooms and bombers, between houses and H-bombs. If they were given the choice, there is little doubt what most people would plump for.
In the 1960s, a number of immigrants were allowed to come to Britain. 800 million of them. But only a small fraction actually entered the country, and many were not white. Colour became more of an issue, and white Jews looked all the more British. Prejudice shifted. So at a time when 90% of London hotels would not accept guests who were black, Jewish MPs were actively seeking legislation to outlaw racism. Until the 1970s, there were still very few Jewish Tories. And in a country with only 300,000 Jews, the Jewish vote remained negligible. The topic of Israel and the Middle East didn't concern the Commons on many occasions. There were other local and national reasons for Jews to be in Parliament.
I'm proud to be Jewish, but I don't think it gives me a particular pride when I'm sitting in the House of Commons. When I'm sitting in the House of Commons, first of all, I'm representing my constituents in Kensington and Chelsea, only a very small proportion of whom are Jewish. I do not take into account their religion in deciding how I carry out my representative role. So unless the House of Commons happens to be debating something specific to Judaism or to the Jewish people, then it's not really a relevant issue at that moment in time.
In 1973, when Egypt invaded Israel, Jewish MPs such as Gerald Kaufman voted along party lines to impose an arms embargo on both countries, including Israel.
I was against it.
What a good idea.
A revolution happened under Margaret Thatcher. She promoted an extraordinary number of MPs to her cabinet who happened to be Jewish: Leon Britton, Michael Howard, Keith Joseph, Nigel Lawson, David Young and Malcolm Rifkin.